Hey friends, it's Eric here from the Bioshock Hub, and I'd like to welcome you back to a brand new video. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're returning, welcome back. Anyways, today's video is going to be a little bit different than what I'm normally accustomed to uploading. What I wanted to upload today is a compilation of a couple of videos I've made a couple of years ago. One of my most favorite subjects within the Bioshock series is the cut and removed content from each and every single game. So, I've made a couple of these videos in the past. If you want to check out the single videos in and of itself, the links will be down in the description below. Or if you just want to watch this entire video and let it play in the background while you listen to it, or if you want to gain some information by seeing what was removed from the Bioshock series, you can watch it all the way through. Just make sure you take your time. If you enjoy it by the end, would you kindly leave a like on the video, leave a comment down below letting me know what you think, and if you'd like to see more compilation videos like this in the future. And also, feel free to hit that subscribe button because we are on the road to 40,000 subscribers, and turn on all post notifications to never miss a future video or a future live stream. So, I hope you enjoy. Sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the over 1 hour of cut and removed content from the Bioshock series. Thank you guys for all the support, and talk to you again very soon. So for this video, I'm going to be going in order, starting from the original Bioshock and then moving all the way until the Burial at Sea episodes. So the first Bioshock piece of removed cut content was that it was supposed to have a single ending. Now, originally, Bioshock was going to have one ending with a sort of ambiguous ending, so it would have been up to you to interpret what that would have meant. And Ken Levine actually remarked in an article, which I'll link in the description along with all of the sources, that, quote, "There are a million different things you can do in every combat. You can play it in a million different ways. Looking into the future for the franchise, there's something I want to figure out, that by the time you get to the ending of that choice path, you have a sense of your impact on the world through lots of little permutations rather than a giant-like ending piece, if you follow my meaning." So, yeah, Bioshock having an original ending or just a singular ending is kind of crazy when you think about it in hindsight, because now we have multiple endings for both Bioshock 1 and 2. So I'm glad that one was personally removed. Next up, we have the research machine. Now, this isn't to be confused with the camera that we actually receive in the game. This was going to be another machine like the Circus of Values or the Ammo Bandito machines. So this would have been more or less to obtain your research rewards. And as I mentioned, it would have been similar to those other vending machines. You would have given an item to receive an item. In this case, it would have basically been your overall processed and finished photographs that you took. So that one, I'm glad didn't make it in the cut, because it just seems like it would have been awkward to have to take the picture, then go to the station, develop your photo, and then rinse and repeat. It just seems kind of tedious in my personal opinion. Now, when I say the two words dual wielding, you might think about dual wielding weapons, like having two shotguns out, or two pistols, or something akimboed like from the Call of Duty series. Well, initially in Bioshock 1, we were going to be able to have some sort of dual wielding mechanic. However, that was implemented in Bioshock 2 instead of Bioshock 1. And what we would have gotten in Bioshock 1 was Jack being able to use a weapon with one hand and have it out and ready, while also being able to use a plasmid with the other, again, out and ready at the same time. Again, it was cut from the game and ultimately placed within Bioshock 2. We're going to move on to a level now, and this one is my personal favorite. This is one that I've talked about many times on the channel, and I've actually brought this up quite a few times, especially to Ken Levine himself during our interview, and that was the Rapture Zoo. I could only imagine what type of animals would have actually been kept in the zoo and what would have happened if they were exposed to Adam. What kind of fights could we have gotten into? Could we have fighten an animal like a gorilla, almost like a brute splicer type gorilla, or a giraffe for that example? To me, that is just an insane thought to think about, but ultimately it got cut, and I know the developers were actually really upset about having to remove this level because they really wanted this to be in the finished game, and I think it would have added perfectly to Fort Frolic, especially with how hectic that whole area is. But alas, we will never see the light of day of the Rapture Zoo, unless someone wants to make a fan mod out there. If you do, let me know. I will definitely record it and I'll review it. Next, we'll be looking at the original gatherers. So push the little sisters aside. We're going to be talking about some weird shit here. So on screen now you can see an early quote-unquote humanoid gatherer, which looks absolutely terrifying. And other than that, they wanted to do other things that I've mentioned in the past, like a crippled dog in a wheelchair, the frog with a funnel up its ass, etc. There was a ton of ideas that they had, but finally they decided, I don't know out of where, but to use the little sisters, and it worked out for the best personally. So also there was another thing cut from the little sisters because he wanted to leave the choice of morality up to the player. So there was going to be sort of an angel and a devil risk and reward factor for either rescuing or harvesting, which we did get a version of that in the game, but not to the extent that Ken Levine wanted it. And also at one point in time, their eyes were going to be glowing red instead of yellow. So the more you know. So there was going to be an actual fourth type of Big Daddy that was in development, and unfortunately it didn't get past the art stage, and that was the Slugbug Big Daddy. Every time I hear that name, I think of the Volkswagen and the actual Slugbug game I would play with my younger siblings, but that's besides the point. So basically this, you can see on screen, would have had the sea slug or a sea slug type of creature almost attached to the Big Daddy on its shoulder, almost parasitically, if that makes sense. Again, it was cut during the concept art, but the overall concept art for it looks pretty badass in my personal opinion. Here's one that I wish would have made the final product, because take a look on screen right now and tell me this thing does not look sick. This is the Adam Anomaly, and this was an enemy concept that was even brought out before production of the game began, so in the very, very early concept stages. Now this would have been an amalgamation of a lot of different things you could have found all throughout Rapture, some of which would have been weapons, some of which would have been tonic advertisements, all mashed up together to create this almost abomination type figure. I don't know if you want to call it an enemy, I don't know if you want to call it a machine. Regardless, it looks sick, and I think it would have fit perfectly within the horror scheme and the horror aspect of Rapture. Let me know what you think down in the comments. So the final three cut pieces of content I'd actually like to talk about within Bioshock's portion of this video can actually be found within the Museum of Orphan Concepts. If you want to check out a video that I made on that quite a while ago, I'll put a card at the top right hand of the corner of the screen for you. All you have to do is click on it, watch it, then come back to this one. If not, I'll leave a link down in the description below. The first one is Stitchy, which is also known as a ranged aggressor, and it was the first splicer ever created. Obviously, it does not look like the splicers we know in the game, so that one is definitely one I'm glad got cut out. And one of the lead artists, Sean Robertson, actually labeled it as probably the worst abortion that Irrational has ever made, so that is hilarious to me. Next up, we have the Yam Hand, and again, it was an early concept from a splicer, and it just was not made for Rapture. Another creator, which was Rob Waters, said it kind of made you wonder what the heck is going on under that dingy burlap sack. And yeah, what is going on? Because its body is so disproportionate to itself that either he's been working out his left arm a lot or something else is going on and I don't want to know. And then finally we have the missing link. And this would have been more of a monstrous splicer, and this would have been basically at the point where a human who was splicing up too much was on the verge of becoming a full-blown splicer where they would have lost their minds. Again, it was cut from the game, but I think this one would have made the most amount of sense to keep in the game. But I trust Irrational, I trust Ken Levine, and I'm glad that they made the right choice with this. Now let's move on to Bioshock 2. Moving on to Bioshock 2, we have some absolutely badass concept arts for a lot of enemies, a lot of those including splicers. The first one I want to cover are the crawlers, and this was supposed to be a rather disturbing looking model, as you can see on the screen now. It would have had an additional mouth on the back of its head, obviously caused from mutations from splicing and just the overall exposure to Adam, and this one would have been terrifying to fight. It really gives me Spider Splicer type vibes, but can you imagine shooting one in the face and then all of a sudden it turns around and has another face? That one would have been terrifying, especially on your first playthrough of Bioshock 2, but that's just my own personal opinion. Staying on the topic of splicers, let's look at the aqua splicers, because there was rumors that there was going to be a lot of underwater combat during the underwater scenes in Bioshock 2, which would have been incredible, but that is just a little bit of a side note from me. You can see on screen now, these things would have been terrifying to come up against. And again, this only made it past the concept art or around the concept art stage, and there were going to be two forms. One, when you were inside of Rapture, it would have actually walked around like a normal human or as close to a human as possible. And when it was in the water, it would have been swimming around just like nothing. And again, you would have been able to actually fight these things. So to have not only worry about the splicers within Rapture, you would have to worry about these things too, and every single underwater level, you would have to worry about them. It would have added a little bit more danger and a little bit of awareness to the game as the player when you progress through these levels, in my personal opinion. These next four I'm going to try to do in a rapid fire succession type mode, because although they are cool concepts, they're just that, obviously, concepts, and there's not too much information known about them. First and foremost, we have the Jesters, and these I assume would have been splicers that maybe were in Fort Frolic and were stuck there and just kind of adapted to their surroundings by splicing within their costumes. Again, not too much is known, so I can't really go in depth about them. Next up, we have Rapture survivors. These would not have been splicers at all. These would have just been random civilians that you would have encountered in Rapture as Subject Delta, and obviously they would have tried to scavenge as much as possible in order to survive. Whether that's weapons, things like guns, swords, etc. They could have hoarded Adam as well if they needed it, but ultimately, again, it was cut. Good idea, but I don't think it would have been good in concept. Next, we have the original Alpha series, and these look terrifying than what we got in the original game. Obviously, they would have been a lot more mutated and a lot more beefy in terms of their overall frame. So I would have loved to see them in the game. Unfortunately, we weren't so blessed in order to get that. And then finally, we have the Demo Daddy. This one I know a lot of you guys enjoy, and I just enjoy the name. But it was also known as the Egg Daddy as well. This one is an absolute unit of a Big Daddy, and for whatever reason, again, it was cut. It would have been more of a military style defense of a Big Daddy, so I can imagine that they would have surrounded Rapture in order to protect it from people trying to get in or trying to attack it. But if they made it inside of Rapture, I have a feeling these things would have been a pain in the ass to fight. Let me know what you think of them down in the comment section below, please. Very quickly, before I discuss the little brothers, which is going to be the last piece within Bioshock 2 I'll be covering, I have a very quick question for you guys. Do you want to see this become a potential series? Obviously, there's enough removed content in the Bioshock series that I could potentially make 3, 4, or even a part 5 of this video in particular. So if you wouldn't mind being so kind, let me know down in the comment section below, or subscribe if you're new and enjoy the content, or you can even leave a like on the video. All of that helps and it's greatly appreciated. If we can hit anywhere from 100 to 300 likes, I know that's a big gap there, but if we can do that, I'll make a part 2 for you guys. Deal? Deal. Now, let's talk about the little brothers, and then we'll move on to the 3 to 5 games worth of content in Bioshock Infinite. So the little brothers would have been just like the little sisters. They were made in order to help gather Adam. Unfortunately, they would have been a failed experiment, and from Ronaldo Tayan, I hope I pronounced his name right, which is one of the concept artists, he says they were supposed to be like little sisters, but they were a failed experiment. Little brothers were supposed to be aggressive, so they couldn't be used for gathering. Unfortunately, like I said, we didn't get them in the game. It would have been nice, it just was not in the cards. Now, let's move on to Bioshock Infinite. Now, in terms of Bioshock Infinite, I really want to cover and discuss the characters that were either removed in general or heavily altered. However, there's one thing in particular I would really like to discuss, and that is that Bioshock Infinite was actually going to have a multiplayer. There was going to be 2 different modes from what we already know. The first one would have been Border Patrol, and it would have been a tower defense style game. And the second co-op mode would have been Spec Ops. Unfortunately, all of these were cut, even though there was a heavy portion of it already designed, and we do have a couple of screenshots of what some of the levels would have looked like, which you could see on screen now. And I think if we would have had multiplayer within Bioshock Infinite, it would have gave that game a lot more longevity and a lot more to do within the game itself. Do you think multiplayer would have worked out in Bioshock Infinite? I personally think it would have. Let me know down in the comments your thoughts and opinions. So the first character we're going to discuss went through a lot of alterations within the development of Bioshock Infinite, and she's one of the main characters, that being Elizabeth. Originally, she was going to be 17 years old instead of 19 or 20, around that ballpark we actually see within Bioshock Infinite, but the devs felt that she was too young for the actual game, obviously. And the first overall prototype would have been labeled as the Gibson Girl, and we could see this from a couple of different reveal trailers that they put out. She would have been completely mute, which I don't think would have added for a good character in this case in terms of Bioshock Infinite, where Elizabeth can actually point out information for you. But the only things she would have actually been able to provide were pointing different directions or throwing you ammo and salts like Elizabeth does in the finished game. So let me know, would you have preferred the Gibson Girl Elizabeth, or do you like the Elizabeth that was in the final version of Bioshock Infinite? Next up, we have the original Daisy Fitzroy. Again, we can go back to the early E3 trailers of Bioshock Infinite. More specifically, I believe it's the 2011 one, where you can actually see a white Daisy Fitzroy and I believe she's Irish if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong. But the concept art that you can see on screen now shows a completely different character model for Daisy Fitzroy, and eventually they switched her completely, which I totally agree with. It makes more sense within the context of the game. And then they just gave this character model the code name of Vox Lady. So she could have just been used in the Vox Rebellion. You could have just thrown her character model in. Wouldn't have made that much of a difference. But I ultimately believe that the character change, the race change, and the actual accent change or the dialect change was absolutely imperative to make Daisy Fitzroy who she was within Bioshock Infinite. Although they're labeled as enemies, I wouldn't consider the automatic gentlemen enemies per se. Essentially, they would have been servants, or as we know, Columbia, they would have been automatonic slaves to the rich of Columbia. We would have seen them all throughout Columbia, and they closely resemble the dollar bill machine and the vigor machine as well. So again, I don't know if they would have been hostile if you went up to them. I'm sure they would have been, especially when they know that you're the quote-unquote false shepherd, but it would have been nice to see more enemy diversity within Bioshock Infinite. Speaking of enemy diversity, we have the Claw Daddy, which is one of the most badass looking ones that I've seen yet, and just look at the concept art for this thing. It would have had a crab-like exoskeleton that would have actually grabbed people and ripped them in half. That sounds so sick, just from a gameplay standpoint. So can you imagine the executions that Booker was doing with the Skyhook? Can you imagine the Claw Daddy doing that with someone random from Columbia, just grabbing a citizen and ripping them in half? Or if they got a hold of Booker or Elizabeth and seeing the chaos that would ensue, that would have been incredible. And this one in particular seems like it would have been awesome to actually fight. Let me know what you think down in the comments, please. Again, we're gonna have another sort of rapid fire section here, because the next couple of enemies I want to talk about, there's not too much information on them, although their concept art is absolutely incredible. So this first one is within the same reveal trailer that the Gibson Girl model was shown. There's an unnamed or sort of a prototype enemy. This kind of looks like potentially a turret or a security camera sort of enemy, but let me know what you think. Next, let's move on to Electro Gloves. This was an enemy that was cut fairly early in production, and it would have been a powered exoskeleton, which I imagine through some sort of shock jockey, where it would have shot firebolts of electricity out of its hands at enemies, again, similar to how shock jockey is used. Next, we have the Enhancer, and for whatever reason it was also known as snake oil. That one just doesn't make sense, and it was cut from the final version of the game. They have a potion or a sort of selection of potions on their sides, as you can see in the actual screenshot, and they would have used them almost like grenades. So I wonder if there would have been a poison type, if there would have been a blinding type, a burning type, etc. So that one could have been rather unique to come across within Bioshock Infinite. The final one I want to talk about in a little bit of detail are the Fink factory workers. In game, we see that they actually can roam around freely, walking, all of that. The original design of them would have been strapped to a machine to where they could only work in a specific area without moving, without sitting, without resting, without laying down. You can see the concept art on the screen now. It would have been absolutely brutal, but I would not have put it past Jeremiah Fink to do something like this to his workers. And then we have the Freaks. These would have been extremely mutated people, and their heads would have actually been locked inside cages,
and they would have grown up to about 9 to 10 feet tall. They would have had all of the characteristics of a splicer that was trapped in Colombia, but these just look absolutely terrifying, and I could only imagine coming across them, let's say in Comstock House or that part of the game. So there's that. The final thing I'd like to discuss within this video on the topic of Bioshock Infinite is 2K Marin, and this would have been a huge what if or what could have been situation. So 2K Marin obviously had a huge part in developing Bioshock 2, but mainly in my personal opinion, they created the best DLC that we've ever received in Bioshock, that being Minerva's Den. So originally, 2K Marin was going to create the first DLC for Bioshock Infinite. This would have taken place on a section of Colombia that would have been set in the ocean. Not sure if it would have had some sort of ties to Rapture. I'm sure it would have, whether it was Colombia discovering Rapture, Colombia going to Rapture and invading. The possibilities are just endless and honestly limitless. But apparently it wasn't up to standards, so the whole idea and the whole concept was just scrapped. Irrational then took over the development of the first DLC, and lo and behold, we get Clash in the Clouds. That is a bummer. If we could have had anything like Minerva's Den in Bioshock Infinite, that would have been phenomenal. And it's such a letdown to know that this could have been a possibility, but at least in my personal opinion, Burial at Sea episode 1 and 2, I know it's pretty divisive. I personally enjoyed it. I know you might have enjoyed it as well, or you could have possibly hated it. But could you imagine if we had something equivalent to a Minerva's Den in Bioshock Infinite? How drastically better of a game and overall experience that would have been. What could have been? What could have been indeed. So as per usual, we'll be starting off with Bioshock 1, moving our way all the way to Burial at Sea, and hopefully I can actually touch on that DLC within this video, because I believe I didn't do that within part 1, so my sincerest apologies. Now, let's start off with Julie Langford. Originally, Julie was supposed to be a male character, and his name would have been Holden. But way far in the developmental progress, that ended up being changed. And that was due to Ken Levine thinking and stating that they didn't have many female characters in the game, which is kind of true because you had only Bridget Tenenbaum, and I believe the Little Sisters, and obviously the female splicers, whether it was the Houdinis, the Spider Splicers, etc. You get the point there. So to switch it from Holden Langford to Julie, I think was a smart idea. What do you guys think? Would it have mattered if Julie ended up being Holden Langford? Please let me know down in the comment section below. I'd very much appreciate that. Coming in at our second spot for the original Bioshock is something that reminds me of Futurama. And if you understand what I mean by this, I absolutely adore you. So these would have been enemies called savants, and they were going to be genetically engineered humans or bosses in the early versions of the game. And they were going to be essentially heads in jars. That's why I said it makes me think of Futurama, because of all of the people's heads that are in jars that are functioning within the Futurama universe. So it would have been exactly like that, and I just don't think it would have had its place within Bioshock. Obviously, they would have been intelligent, they would have been smart, but as a boss or an enemy, I don't believe it would have been that believable of a fight. So I'm definitely glad we weren't fighting heads in jars. That just would have been a little weird for a Bioshock, but hey, that's just my personal opinion. Next, we have the original Grenadier Splicer, which eventually ended up turning into the Nitro Splicer. As you can see on screen, nothing wrong with it, but this would have been a rather big boy. So, this was a large gray model spliced to carry giant grenades to obviously throw at the player, just like the Nitro Splicer. So essentially, he would have been a walking grenade launcher. He would have also had a backpack and a messenger bag for the grenades and the additional smaller bags attached to his pants. He also had a strange black tool sticking out of his chest and bandages covering the majority of his arms and face. So it seems like whatever happened to this individual, they really tried patching themselves up with a lot of things like tape or bandages, etc. So, big boy throwing grenades at you, that definitely would have been a lot more terrifying than a regular Nitro Splicer. Now, this next one seems to rather be a favorite for the fandom, that being Mommy Dearest. So if we go back in time and look at the art book of Bioshock 1, that being called Bioshock Breaking the Mold, it reveals the illustration that you're going to be seeing on the screen right now. And obviously we did not see her in the final game. However, nothing is really known about this character. There isn't any information, there's no backstory. I think it was just an idea that the developers had. They sketched it out, or the artists, I should say, just sketched it out, kind of threw it at the wall to see if it stuck, and unfortunately, it didn't. However, I do believe that this was the earlier versions of the Lady Smith splicers, just with a little bit of a difference in appearance, dress, and just very minor things here and there. Let me know what you think of that down in the comments, would you kindly? Now, the final enemy I'd like to focus on within the Bioshock 1 aspect of this video are the early splicers and their concept arts. Some of these would have made the original Bioshock infinitely more terrifying, and you see what I did there? Nice little pun. Hey, I like my puns. But regardless, a lot of the pictures that I've seen of the concept art of these splicers are just downright terrifying, and I'll put a couple of them on the screen right now. The deeper I dive down the rabbit hole of cut and removed assets, content, concepts of the Bioshock series, the more I wish we could have actually seen some of these in action. So, as you can see, we see some that straight up look like scary monsters out of a horror movie. The Jellyman looks absolutely incredible, and some of them just look extremely badass. There's no way to sugarcoat it. So for yourself, I would highly recommend going and just checking out the early concept arts of a lot of different splicers, because when I say there are a ton of these, I legitimately mean there are a shit ton of early splicers that just didn't end up making the cut, which is ultimately unfortunate, because a lot of these, again, I believe would have made Bioshock an infinitely more scary game to play. And obviously with you and the isolation of being in Rapture, trying to survive, would have been incredible. Some of them, it makes sense why they got cut. Others, I could have definitely seen making the final game. Let me know what your favorites are down in the comment section below. For me personally, I think the Jellyman might be my personal favorite just because of how badass it looks. So let me know. Overall, the last thing I'd like to discuss that was removed or just completely scrapped from Bioshock is a weapon called the Bioweapon. This was the chemical thrower before they actually made the chemical thrower, and instead of shooting out fire or electricity or, liquid nitrogen, you would have actually fired out plasmids. How badass does that sound? And the 4 plasmids that we know 100% for sure that they would have shot out include the following. My personal favorite, insect swarm, so not only having insects at the palm of your hand, you would have had them within a weapon as well. The other three are kind of toss-ups, and they're up in the air for your own interpretation. We would have had a berserk toxin, which I imagine could have been something like enrage. We have a disease cloud, I'm not entirely sure about that one, and then we have a generic repellent. That could have been maybe something like telekinesis or electrobolt, just your base plasmid that you get at the start of the game. Interesting though, both the bioweapon and its ammunition actually did exist in Rapture, and apparently if you look around the Silver Wing, you can actually see it, but it's not used in its original function. You can just see cans of the berserk toxin that are stacked around target practice stands around the Rapture's Grand Carnival in the challenge rooms. So that might be why we don't see it a lot. At least for me, because I know I sure as hell don't play that DLC, because Bioshock 1's DLC just wasn't it for me. So if you have a very keen eye and want to actually go explore the challenge rooms for this, by all means, go for it and see if you can actually find the cans of the berserk toxin. So that is my challenge to you. Moving on to Bioshock 2, we have a fact that I really enjoy bringing up to you guys, and we're going to be looking at the original Eleanor Lamb. Originally, besides her being a big sister at the end of the game to help Subject Delta, she was going to be a big sister during the entirety of the game. And there was going to be a plot twist, obviously, revealing that the big sister would have been the daughter of our main character, Subject Delta. And we would have had multiple battles with her as well, obviously with rescuing the little sisters or dealing with them however you wish, 3 of them to be specific. You would have fought a big sister along with Eleanor. So thankfully that side got removed. The fact I like telling you about is that it was going to be revealed that Eleanor was the biological daughter of Subject Delta. And I want to believe that this is still canon. So I'm going to. You can't stop me. But apparently it was via a sperm donation, and it was against Subject Delta's will. So yeah, I can see why that wouldn't have been a good look. Just throwing that out there now. But again, I want to think that it's canon that Eleanor Lamb is indeed the real biological daughter of Subject Delta. Do you guys consider that canon as well? Especially if it's a removed piece of content, because they do act like father and daughter, at least in terms of the protectiveness. I know, obviously, big daddies are supposed to protect their little sisters, but it felt a little more parental rather than territorial, if that makes any sense. Let me know down in the comment section below. Now, I will say I wish we saw more quote-unquote ghosts in Bioshock and Bioshock 2, and I say ghosts in quotes because obviously we get memories or flashbacks of previous Adam users by taking Adam ourselves. However, this next one would have actually taken that and shoved it into the extreme category, and that would have been a drug called Eden. So this drug, which would have been taken by Delta, would have actually brought you back to a preserved memory, that being of Ava Tate, I believe. And it would have been at a wild party within Dionysus Park before that asshole, even though I love you, Bill Lobley, Stanley Poole, flooded it. This drug would have caused extremely powerful hallucinations, and you can see on the screen there would have been puppets and marionettes, so that just would have been an acid trip in and of itself. But these would have made Delta see memories from his past, basically catching him up to speed in terms of what he missed during the time he was quote unquote dead, and then obviously leading up to the time that he was resurrected within the Vita Chamber. This is where that aforementioned 20-foot Senator Cohen monster bunny would have applied. So in this context, I can understand that making Senator Cohen a 20-foot monster bunny would have been actually rather appropriate. I'm still glad that they didn't do it because that's my favorite character and I just wouldn't have been able to take that seriously. What do you guys think? The final two things I'd like to discuss for the Bioshock 2 portion revolves around Minerva's Den, and I feel that I didn't give this DLC as well as the Burial at Sea DLC its due diligence in part 1, so I'd like to do that here. So, very quick backstory and context to the hydropower that you're going to see on screen. Obviously, we know through Bioshock 1 that there is some sort of lava or lava system that's put in place that actually helps power Rapture. We drain that and we actually get to go to Andrew Ryan. This same concept would have likely been applied to Minerva's Den as well, although it's not explicitly stated, we can assume so. So, this concept art shows a completely different way that Minerva's Den would have actually been powered, and that would have been through hydro-powered pumps. It would have been viewable from the Thinker's Chamber, and in the end, unfortunately, there is no reference to any sort of hydroelectric plants or power plants that would have actually functioned and properly ran Minerva's Den. So that's why I said we can assume it's just like Hephaestus. Now, the second thing I'd like to discuss is that they were going to have a Big Ben of Rapture. For those of you who don't know, Big Ben is a huge clock tower within the UK, for all my non-UK viewers out there. The significance of it, I'm not sure what would have been, because obviously Charles Milton Porter was not British, though he did live in London during the Blitz during World War II, so I guess that would have made sense if they wanted to actually build that and incorporate that backstory more into the main story of Bioshock Infinite. But this would have been located at the top of Minerva's Den. It would have been illuminated from the inside, allowing it to be seen from all around Rapture, so I assume we could have seen it during the base game itself. And unfortunately, it was cut, but I do like the concept of trying to tie the backstory of Charles Milton Porter and even Pearl Porter with the Big Ben of Rapture, especially when you know what happens to Pearl Porter in London. So that would have been a nice touch. But again, it's one of those things that in hindsight just would not have made sense in game. So I'm actually relieved it got cut, because that would have just been a little more depressing having to think of that constantly while traversing Minerva's Den. Now let's move our way up into the clouds and to Columbia. This first one in particular is going to be a little bit of a 2-for-1 special. We have the Crow, or Charles, along with Henry Saltonstall. Saltonstall was a politician within Columbia, and we can see that through various trailers that was released during the time of Bioshock Infinite's hype. And unfortunately, he didn't make the cut in the final game, but he would have flipped from Saltonstall to someone completely different at the snap of a finger. And Charles, on the other hand, was a servant of his, and he would have been a vigor junkie as well. The only really depressing thing about these two being cut is that we see that telekinesis would have clearly been in the game for Bioshock Infinite in these trailers. I'm going to put one of them down in the description for you to check out, but I wish telekinesis would have been in Bioshock Infinite. That would have made things a lot more fun, and it would have gave us something else to mess around with as well. And especially with Jeremiah Fink and Dr. Suchong sharing ideas, I think Fink could have made his own version of telekinesis. Moving on, we had enemies called magicians. And as you can see on screen now, there would have been a female magician using her powers. And again, it looks like they would be using telekinesis. However, there would have been an idea for this sort of theatrical type of magician existing in both male and female variations. They would have been inspired by Sander Cohen, and they would have possessed telekinesis. Again, I wish it would have been in Bioshock Infinite, but every time I say it, I know it's not or ever going to happen, so I need to shut the fuck up about it, because that's annoying. If you guys want to punch me in the nose for saying that telekinesis should be in Infinite, I don't blame you. But this would have been a rather interesting enemy to actually fight, because I feel that there would have been a lot of strategy going into this. Or you could just do what I and probably many other people have done and use something like charge along with a piece of gear that would have either electrocuted or set the magician on fire. So yeah, in theory, this would have been an interesting enemy, but in practice, I don't think it would have been very practical. Next up, we have the Merged, and thank Christ, these things did not make the final cut of the game. And I'm not even going to call them people, I'm going to call them things, because they should have been aborted at the time of their own conception. Essentially, what would have happened is using tears would have caused either deterioration or actual merging, hence the name, of past or future versions of yourself with present. So you could have gone in a tear completely normal and come out through another tear with a baby version of yourself stuck to your face. That would have been absolutely gross to have to deal with. And can you imagine if that happened to either Booker or Elizabeth? That would have been fucking nasty. Now, it's safe to say that the concept arts from a lot of the developers and the artists themselves are extremely fascinating, but it seems that Rob Waters specifically went extremely hard with a lot of these concept arts. So we would have had a little sister counterpart within Columbia. I'm not exactly sure what their use would have been, because obviously there weren't corpses all around Columbia where the little sister could have went and gathered Adam. So I'm not entirely sure what their purpose was going to be or what it would have been. I think they wanted to just figure out a way to incorporate something from Bioshock 1 and 2 and try to make an equal or a little bit of an opposite counterpart to that within Columbia. And it makes sense with the whole constants and variables type thing. And the concept art alone looks incredibly badass for the little sister counterparts. However, again, I just don't see the logic behind it. And I also don't see the plausibility and the actual overall effectiveness of having a counterpart of a little sister in Columbia. Just from a logical standpoint, like I said. There aren't corpses that are littered around Columbia where they could just walk up, stick them in the neck with a needle, and take out the atom, or in this case, the salts. So, do you think they would have worked, or do you think this would have been a failed idea if it made it in the final game? This next enemy, just from concept art alone, looks extremely, and I mean extremely badass. And I think this was the inspiration for the sirens at the end that finally made the final cut of Infinite. So a concept art that was circulating, as you can see on the screen right now, would have been of an enemy known as a Resurrector. And obviously, by the name, it would have had necromancy type abilities where they could bring people, like the sirens, back from the dead and use them as essentially their puppets to go and fight Booker DeWitt. So I don't know the design of it as to why they wanted to dress them like a cardinal of the Catholic Church, but then again, Colombia, extremely religious, so that would have made a little bit more sense. The other two concept arts don't really make sense, so I wanted to show you this one in particular. Again, would have been absolutely incredible. And with these, there would have been something coming out of their hands, as you can see within the actual concept art picture of itself, and they would have been considered quote-unquote bleeding hearts. And I believe this is where they would have actually summoned something out of their hands to resurrect those dead enemies. Again, extremely badass enemy in thought, but how would it have worked in execution? We don't know, and we'll never know, unfortunately. Now, this next one makes a lot more sense, especially when you take into consideration the paranoia of Comstock and just the paranoia of people in Colombia overall when Booker arrives. And again, it's made by Rob Waters. This would have been an automatronic security camera. So instead of an enemy walking around with the typical body, head, etc., its head would have been an actual security camera. So instead of the voice of silence acting like sort of a watch or lookout and alarm, this could have actually actively surveyed, I should say, Booker as you make your way throughout Colombia. So again, this one would have made a lot of sense to me, but it might be one of those things where in theory it sounds amazing, but in execution it just wouldn't work. And we can say that going all the way back to Bioshock 1 with a teleportation plasmid. It sounds like an extremely good idea, but in practice it just doesn't work, it's broken, it doesn't make sense, etc. It was cut for a reason, so we just have to take that at face value. These next enemies would have been some of my favorite enemies in the game if they actually stayed, and just the concept art alone makes me absolutely love them. And we can kind of see them in the final version of the game, more towards Burial at Sea, but we do get a partial Vigor Junkie with Cornelius Slate. You can see little bits and pieces of crystals coming out of his head from the Shock Jockey. And then eventually you can see them as Old Man Winter Splicers in Burial at Sea. So you can see them on the screen now. The more they spliced, or in this case, the more of the vigors that they consumed, the more the vigor itself would have consumed them. So it was a risk and reward type situation. It would have been interesting. It would have been awesome to have an enemy like this, but alas, we don't get too many. We could have had different things like the actual crows pop up all over the place and have them actually appear crow-like. Or same thing with Devil's Kiss, there could have been flames coming out of someone, not like the fireman, but an actual person. I don't know, the possibilities could have been endless. The final two things I'd like to discuss for the base game of Bioshock Infinite are the artillery cannon and the Vox siren, both of which were seen either in the early gameplay demonstrations of Bioshock Infinite or the E3 2011 gameplay reveal. So, the artillery cannon, obviously we didn't get it in the finished game. I imagine they would have been all throughout Colombia, and they would have been used to shoot things down like motorized patriots, turrets, zeppelins, or just other invading forces to help protect Colombia. So, it's a shame that those didn't make the final cut. Can you imagine using possession on that to actually turn that against your enemies? That would have been wonderful. Now, the Vox siren is a rather interesting one. We see this during the E3 2011 gameplay reveal, but unfortunately, this again did not make the final cut of the game. Imagine after Booker and Elizabeth go through the terror, where they go into a world where Booker died helping the Vox Revolution. Daisy alludes to you as a ghost of Booker DeWitt or an imposter, So keep that in mind. You go a little bit during Bioshock Infinite, you progress, and you start fighting the Vox. Can you imagine fighting a huge group of Vox Populi, then all of a sudden having one of them break off and sound this siren? This would have brought reinforcements, and that could have included a wide variety of Vox members, such as the RPG users, the motorized patriots, their own zeppelins. The possibilities are endless, and the fact that they did not utilize that in the game really upsets me, because that could have made for a lot of interesting fights. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below of that. Finally, let's end with Burial at Sea just as a whole. It doesn't matter if it was episode 1 or episode 2. These two enemies would have been in it regardless, or theoretically should have been in it. The first would have been Grenade Launcher or RPG Splicers, and as you can see on the screen now, these would have resembled ones that you could have seen in Columbia too. So these would have made sense in Rapture itself. These unique types of enemies would have actually had armor, and they could have made it themselves too, just from scavenging Rapture. Obviously, they didn't appear anywhere in the game, but the model's design again is used in the similar appearance of the male splicers encountered within the store, albeit more buff and obviously with grenade launchers or rocket launchers. In this case, this would have more or less resembled one of the heavy hitters of Bioshock Infinite that they brought from Columbia and made their own versions in Rapture. That would have been rather interesting, especially when you have to actually fight them. You imagine during episode 2 encountering one of them and having to creep behind them as Elizabeth and use the skyhook to knock him out. I feel that if you messed up, you would have just gotten blown away with one of the rocket launchers. So it would have been funny now that I think about it, but in practice, again, I'm not sure if it would have been good or just at least an execution. Now, the final character I would like to discuss in this video are the jockey splicers. For whatever reason, these were cut from the game. Again, not sure why. Maybe it was one of those good in theory, bad in execution types of enemies, but they very similarly resemble the Vigor Junkies. However, instead of still having somewhat humanity with the Vigor Junkies, the jockey splicers themselves would have been consumed by their own habits. So they would have looked a lot more non-human like, and they would have had a lot more protrusions of shock jockey. Now, these characters in particular are alluded to by Booker DeWitt in Burial at Sea, but again, they are completely removed from the game. It would have been interesting to come across these guys, especially when you would have to fight them alongside things like the Old Man Winter Vigor Junkie, but again, I think that this might have been a better enemy in theory, in hindsight at least, rather than a enemy in execution. Again, I know I've asked this multiple times, but let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Obviously, if you've played the original Bioshock, you know the opening with Jack on the plane reciting his opening monologue. Well, obviously, he's on a plane. We don't know too much about it, but we actually do have information about it. So first and foremost, the captain was named Cal Franklin, and also the only reason he was cut out is obviously because he wouldn't have been a main character at all. There's a lot of unused audio lines that just didn't make the game, which is quite unfortunate, but again, I do understand why. And also, on top of that, there was an actual official name for the plane as well, that being Apollo Air Flight DF-0301. So Yeah, the plane that we don't even see, besides obviously after it crashes, had a name, and obviously it was flown by Captain Cal Franklin, who unfortunately we don't get to see in the game. Pretty interesting if you ask me. Now, this next enemy, I want you to close your eyes and try to imagine it as best as possible. They were called aggressors, and these were individuals who, over time, would purposely mutate themselves in order to obviously become better equipped with weapons and just overall better with weapons and become stronger foes. Obviously, as the development cycle continued, these enemies became creepier and creepier and creepier the more that they actually became human. It was almost like a reverse type of splicing effect. Unfortunately, obviously, with everything going on in Rapture, that wouldn't have necessarily made sense, although there was the removed concept of the Rapture survivors. So I guess in theory it could have worked, but they ultimately in the end removed them from the game. And if you're interested in actually seeing them, I believe they're included within the Museum of Orphan Concepts. So if you want to go check those out, the DLC in Bioshock 1 is your way to do so. Very early on within development of the original Bioshock, Irrational decided that they wanted the splicers to be almost more human-like. Not the splicers that we see in the finished product, but the early stages of splicing. So obviously they would have looked a lot more human, almost like Jack in a way. So there would have been, I believe, 5 in total, one being the breadwinner, and then 4 others, which I believe are nicknamed Bellboy, Greaser, Waitress, and Schoolgirl, as you can see by the archetypes from the photo on screen now. I would honestly appreciate more splicers in the game. Obviously, the budget limited how many splicers and how many enemies we could have actually fought and seen within Bioshock 1, but if they had a bigger budget, it would have been awesome to fight all of these different types of splicers, all these different types of big daddies that were ultimately cut, and just all of these different enemies that were cut. So let me know, do you think these splicers would have made an interesting addition to the game, or are you glad that they didn't make the final cut? Let me know down in the comment section below, would you kindly? In addition to a lot of the splicers and characters that ended up getting tweaked around within the development cycle, the Gatherer's Garden, or in this case, the Gatherer Machine, would have been very, very heavily altered. As you can see by the picture on screen, it looks more like a Vita chamber, really, and it's got a very unique design. Obviously, it's more feminine. You can tell that it's got the bow on it. It's got the 2 little sisters on the outsides as well, but this is something that I feel would have been a little slightly out of place for Rapture. I feel that the Gatherer's Garden overall that we received within Bioshock 1 and 2 just looks overall better. Don't get me wrong, this looks incredibly well done, and big props to Mauricio Tejarina, who I believe is the designer behind this. It's definitely unique looking, but I just believe that the overall Gatherer's Garden just fit more to the style of Rapture in and of itself. The final thing I'd like to cover within Bioshock in this particular video is another plasmid that was cut late in development within Bioshock. And no, it's not teleportation. I've covered that particular plasmid in the past, so if you want to check out that video, I'll leave a link to the video down in the description, or you can wait till the video is over and I'll put it on the end screen for you. In fact, this plasmid was called Parasitic Healing. The synopsis of this is essentially that Jack would have fired some sort of projectile. This projectile would have hit an enemy, whether it was a splicer, Big Daddy, etc., and obviously it would damage them. But here's the bonus. While damaging them, it would also heal Jack in the process. And obviously with most other plasmids, this one in particular would have had 3 levels of advancement too. In addition, certain Spider Splicer variants would have been able to use this as well, instead of just having the Houdini splicers using things like Incinerate. So, not only would that have impacted your overall gameplay, but it would have impacted the overall gameplay of splicers that you would have come across that would have used parasitic healing. So, this one is something that I definitely wish would have been in the final finished product. However, Irrational knew best, and I'm sure something went wrong when testing, so ultimately, that's why we didn't see it in the game. It's honestly quite unfortunate. Now let's take a look at the criminally underrated Bioshock 2. For this one though, we're going to have to backtrack a little bit to Bioshock 1. Remember when Jack could see quote-unquote ghosts, and what he was actually seeing was other people's memories due to the atom that he ingested? Well, ghosts, or in this case, quote-unquote ghosts, were supposed to be in Bioshock 2 as well. And in fact, it was actually shown within the launch trailer that there would have been ghosts dancing. Unfortunately, these were cut from the game, and we didn't get to see them through the lens of Delta, technically, which is kind of a shame. Obviously, Delta is doing the same exact thing as Jack. He's going around, he's using Adam, he's ingesting Adam by obviously injecting it into his arm or into the port in his arm, getting all of these plasmids, getting all of these tonics, and he doesn't see the ghosts. The ghosts are nowhere to be found. So, what happened between Bioshock 1 and Bioshock 2? Is the Adam that is reused more pure? Does it just not cause side effects besides becoming addicted? This leaves more questions than it actually gives answers, which, again, is quite unfortunate. But regardless, it's still pretty damn interesting. This next topic that I'd like to cover is something that genuinely hurts me to cover, because the idea of it and the ideas that I get from it, just actually reading what they wanted to do, there's so many things that they could have done, and it's so damn frustrating that they had to cut it due to time constraints. So I want you to imagine this. Imagine all of the times that either Subject Delta or Subject Sigma in Minerva's Den had to go walk on the outside of Rapture in the ocean. Now, take that, and knowing you wouldn't have to be in combat, and flip that on its head and actually be in combat underwater. Underwater combat was initially planned to be implemented within Bioshock 2, and there would have been many more underwater and open levels. However, like I said, it was scrapped due to time constraints. So things like those aqua splicers could have been a thing. Potentially fighting something like a shark or a giant squid would have been badass. The possibilities are endless. And again, what could have been? What could have been? Now here's a blast from the past. I don't remember if it was part 1 or part 2 that I uploaded, but I covered the topic of the little brothers that would have been in the game, but unfortunately they were scrapped as well. Well, when you progress through Bioshock 2 and when you get into Persephone, more specifically Inner Persephone, there was going to be something for the little brothers that would have been there if they were in the game. and they were called Little Brother Therapy Rooms. As you can see by the picture on the screen now, these don't look very pleasant. On the outside, you see a tube basically pumping something on the inside. I'm not sure if that's some sort of mind control thing or pheromone thing or maybe even an oxygen tank, but it honestly just doesn't look good at all, and it looks quite creepy. Now, when you pull back the curtain, it's just a bed, but I just wonder what's going on when that curtain is closed and there's a potential scientist or someone else inside the tent with the little brother. Obviously, it's all hypothetical because both ideas were scrapped, but it's definitely interesting to think about what could have happened, especially if they would have been in the finalized game. The final portion of this video that I want to discuss about Bioshock 2 is going to cover Minerva's Den and what they wanted it to actually look like. So originally they wanted it to be more Greek in appearance. Obviously with Rapture, you know that Art Deco was the end all be all for everything Rapture, whether it was the lighthouse designs or just when you get down to Rapture in and of itself. So the fact that they wanted to go with a Greek appearance is kind of something that seems a little bit out of left field, so I'm definitely glad that this one didn't make the cut. To me, it's just a bit confusing, but I'm all for brainstorming, I'm all for trying out and thinking about new ideas, and even trying them out in practice. Unfortunately, this is just something that I don't think would have resonated with fans. It would have broke the immersion, especially having something that looked completely different than Rapture, and obviously continuing the story or adding on to the story of Bioshock 2. You're going from the Art Deco scene to Greek architecture. It just would break the immersion, and I just don't think it would have fit well personally. Now let's move on to the now over 10-year-old Bioshock Infinite. The first thing I want to talk about is rather hilarious in my personal opinion. So let's talk about the Hall of Heroes as a level. Obviously, as you know, you get to see some of Booker's past in the Hall of Heroes. You meet Slate again, and eventually you get Shock Jockey from Slate because that's what Booker and Elizabeth were after during that whole level in Hall of Heroes, Soldier's Field, etc. So eventually you get Shock Jockey, and you have two options whether to spare Slate by shooting him in the head or leaving him alone, allowing Comstock and his men to take him prisoner. Well, this could have turned out completely different, and let me tell you why. When I say that this was in the very early development stages of Bioshock Infinite, I mean very early development stages. So, the Hall of Heroes we know today, that wouldn't have been the case. You want to know why? It would have been a Tunnel of Love ride. So, yeah, it would have been a Tunnel of Love ride. All I can think about right now, and since it's in my brain and I have to think about it, you guys have to think about it too, because this is fucking hilarious, and I wish it would have made it into the final game just as a funny Easter egg or something equivalent to that. Can you imagine Slate and Booker finally meeting from God knows how long ago? They get together, then they go through the Tunnel of Love. Aww, what a story. What a story that would have been. Again, it's in my brain. You guys have to think about it too. Booker and Slate in a Tunnel of Love ride. I want someone to make fan art of that because, again, that is fucking hilarious. This next contraption is a little bit confusing. Now, the reason why I say that is because of the existence of the skyhook and obviously the skyline. So the early concept art for this was that they wanted to incorporate a jetpack, and I genuinely don't know why. Maybe they didn't want to use the skyline and the skyhook, and that might have been early on in the development cycle. But then as they started developing and developing and developing, the skyline and the skyhook just seemed to actually make more sense in order to travel. I imagine the jetpack would have been a pain in the ass to control, especially with a controller, or if you're on mouse and keyboard. I just genuinely don't think it would have made for a good transportation type of gadget in this case. It looks cool, don't get me wrong, but I think just for convenience factor, the skyhook and the skyline blows the jetpack out of the water. What do you guys think? Do you think the jetpack would have been a better way to traverse Columbia, or do you think the skyline and the skyhook was perfectly executed? Again, if you want, let me know. Next up is a little bit of something that is kind of cheating, but I'm gonna let it slide just for one different picture. And again, it's going to be the Mad Toy Maker's shop. I showed you the original picture that actually looked like it would have been an entire combat area. Well, this picture that you're going to see looks a lot more impressive because it's got that Art Nouveau style of architecture. And I can imagine the Mad Toy Maker making his toys inside this contraption, and this looks like some sort of haunted house that would have trap doors everywhere that would have led you into fights with the Mad Toy Maker's toys, or even worse, it could have led into a dead end where you and Elizabeth would just die. There again would have been so many different possibilities, not only with the Mad Toy Maker, but with the Mad Toy Maker's toys and the Mad Toy Maker's shop as well. Unfortunately, we'll never be able to see what this enemy would have looked like, what this enemy could have been, and how impactful this enemy could have been. In my opinion, I think he would have been badass, but that's just me. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below, please. So for the final thing I'd like to discuss within the Bioshock Infinite section of this video is something that actually interests me in real life as well. I love history, whether it's learning about the world wars, the weapons that were used, the advancements in technology of said weapons, or just going back in time and looking at the weapons back then. This includes something called the Maxim gun. So, in Bioshock Infinite, there was going to be a Maxim gun, or something very, very similar to it, that would have been called the Skyline Pack machine gun. This, again, as mentioned, would have been a weapon that looked extremely similar to the Maxim gun. However, it would have been adapted to be carried on the Skyline through something called the Skyline Pack. Obviously, there's not too much information known about it, though I wish I could talk to whoever came up with the overall concept art of this and ask them questions, because I'm genuinely fascinated by this in particular. This weapon would have been smaller than a full-sized machine gun, obviously, because it would have had to be on the Skyline, and it would have been, obviously, very good in terms of stopping power. But obviously it was cut, or in this case dropped, and we get the Gatling gun as well as the crank gun that the motorized Patriots use. So in my opinion, the Maxim gun, or the equivalent of the Maxim gun that was in the concept art that was shown on screen, looked incredible. And I would have loved to run around as Booker with this weapon instead of the crank gun. Let me know what you think of this weapon in particular. Do you think it looks badass? Do you think it wouldn't fit the time period of Columbia? Let me know. I love this weapon. I love the Maxim gun in terms of learning about it. And overall, I just love learning about history. So the fact that they were going to incorporate something like this into the game, and unfortunately it dropped out, it bums me out, but I can understand.
So with that being said, ladies, gentlemen, and everybody else watching, I hope you enjoyed this compilation of over 1 hour of cut and removed content from the Bioshock series. If you want to see more compilations in the future, leave a comment down below and just let me know what you'd like to see moving forward. Again, I appreciate if you've watched all the way up until this point. It means the world to me. Also, thank you so much for all the support. Even when I haven't been here as often as I'd like, you guys continuously show support on the videos, and I honestly don't think a thank you is enough. So, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate each and every single one of you more than I can ever explain. So, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you have a great rest of your day or night whenever you're watching this. And with that being said, I will talk to you in the next video or the next live stream very, very soon. Take care and stay safe, guys.